Chapter 4. The atmosphere of the city became stranger as the days went on. It was as if something had gone out of New York, the realness or the importance of it, and the city was putting on a show just for him, a colossal show with its buses, taxis, and hurrying people on the sidewalks, its television shows in all the Third Avenue bars, its movie marquees lighted up in broad daylight, and its sound effects of thousands of honking horns and human voices talking for no purpose whatsoever. As if when his boat left the pier on Saturday, the whole city of New York would collapse with a poof like a lot of cardboard on a stage. Or maybe he was afraid. He hated water. He had never been anywhere before on water, except to New Orleans, from New York, and back to New York again. And then he had been working on a banana boat, mostly below deck, and he had hardly realized he was on the water. The few times he had been on deck, the sight of water had at first frightened him, then made him feel sick, and he had always run below deck again, where, contrary to what people said, he had felt better. His parents had drowned in Boston Harbor, and Tom had always thought that probably had something to do with it, because as long as he could remember, he had been afraid of water, and he had never learned how to swim. It gave Tom a sick, empty feeling at the pit of his stomach to think that in less than a week he would have water below him, miles deep, and that undoubtedly he would have to look at it most of the time, because people on ocean liners spent most of their time on deck, and it was particularly unchic to be seasick, he felt. He had never been seasick, but he came very near it several times in those last days, simply thinking about the voyage to Cherbourg. He had told Bob Delancey that he was moving in a week, but he hadn't said where. Bob did not seem interested anyway. They saw very little of each other at the 51st Street place. Tom had gone to Mark Prager's house in East 45th Street. He still had the keys to pick up a couple of things he had forgotten, and he had gone at that hour when he had thought Mark wouldn't be there. But Mark had come in with his new housemate, Joel, a thin drip of a young man who worked for a publishing house, and Mark had put on one of his suave, please do just as you like act for Joel's benefit, though if Joel hadn't been there, Mark would have cursed him out in language that even a Portuguese sailor wouldn't have used. Mark, his given name was of all things Muchalus, was an ugly mug of a man with a private income and a hobby of helping out young men in temporary financial difficulties by putting them up in his two-story, three-bedroom house and playing God by telling them what they could and couldn't do around the place and by giving them advice as to their lives and their jobs, generally rotten advice. Tom had stayed there 3 months, though, for nearly half that time Mark had been in Florida, and he had had the house all to himself. But when Mark had come back, he had to make a big stink about a few pieces of broken glassware, Mark playing God again, the stern father, and Tom had gotten angry enough for once to stand up for himself and talk to him back. Whereupon Mark had thrown him out after collecting $63 from him for broken glassware. The old tightwad. He should have been an old maid, Tom thought, at the head of a girls' school. Tom was bitterly sorry he had ever laid eyes on Mark Prager, and the sooner he could forget Mark's stupid pig-like eyes, his massive jaw, his ugly hands with the gaudy rings, waving through the air, ordering this and that from everybody, the happier he would be. The only one of his friends he felt like telling about his European trip was Cleo, and he went to see her on the Thursday before he sailed. Cleo Dobell was a slim, dark-haired girl who could have been anything from 23 to 30. Tom didn't know. Who lived with her parents in Grade Square and painted in a small way, a very small way, in fact, on little pieces of ivory not bigger than postcard stamps that had to be viewed through a magnifying glass. And Cleo used a magnifying glass when she painted them. But think how convenient it is to be able to carry all my paintings in a cigar box. Other painters had rooms and rooms to hold their canvases, Cleo said. Cleo lived in her own suite of rooms with a little bath and kitchen at the back of her parents' section of the apartment. And Cleo's apartment was almost rather dark since it had no exposure except to a tiny backyard overgrown with ailanthus trees that blocked out the light. Cleo always had the lights on, dim ones, which gave a nocturnal atmosphere whatever the time of day. Except for the night when it had met her, Tom had seen Cleo only in a close-fitted velvet slacks of various colors and gaily striped silk shirts. They had taken to each other from the very first night, when Cleo had asked him to dinner at her apartment on the following evening. Cleo always asked him up to her apartment, and there was somehow never any thought that he might ask her out to dinner, or the theater, or do any of the ordinary things that a young man was expected to do with a girl. She didn't expect him to bring her flowers or books or candy when he came for dinner or cocktails, though Tom did bring her a little gift sometimes because it pleased her so. Cleo was the one person he could tell that he was going to Europe, and why. He did. Cleo was enthralled, as he had known she would be. Her red lips parted in her long, pale face, and she brought her hand down on her velvet thighs and exclaimed, "Tommy! How too marvelous this is! It's just like out of a Shakespeare or something." That was just what Tom thought, too. That was just what he had needed someone to say. Cleo fussed around him all evening, asking him if he had this and that, Kleenexes and cold tablets and woolen socks because it starts raining in Europe in the fall, and his vaccinations. Tom said he felt pretty well prepared. "Just don't come to see me off, Cleo. I don't want to be seen off." "Oh, of course not," Cleo said, understanding perfectly. "Oh, Tommy, I think that's such fun. Will you write me everything that happens with Dickie? You're the only person I know who ever went to Europe for a reason." He told her about visiting Mr. Greenleaf's shipyards in Long Island, the miles and miles of tables with machines making shiny metal parts, varnishing and polishing wood, the dry docks with boat skeletons of sizes that impressed her with the terms Mr. Greenleaf had used, combings, inwales, keelsons, and cheens. He described the second dinner at Mr. Greenleaf's house, when Mr. Greenleaf had presented him with a wristwatch. He showed the wristwatch to Cleo, not a fabulously expensive wristwatch, but still an excellent one, and just the style Tom might have chosen for himself, a plain white face with fine black Roman numerals in a simple gold setting with an alligator strap. "Just because I happened to say a few days before that I didn't own a watch," Tom said. He really adopted me like a son, and Cleo, too, was the only person he knew to whom he could say that. Cleo sighed. "Men, you have all the luck. Nothing like that could ever happen to a girl. Men are so free." Tom smiled. It often seemed to him that it was the other way around. "Is that the lamb chops burning?" Cleo jumped up with a shriek. After dinner, she showed him 5 or 6 of her latest paintings, a couple of romantic portraits of a young man they both knew, in an open-collared white shirt, 3 imaginary landscapes of a jungle-like land, derived from the view of the ailanthus trees out her window. The hair of the little monkeys in the paintings was really astoundingly well done, Tom thought. Cleo had a lot of brushes with just one hair in them, and even these varied from comparatively coarse to ultra-fine. They drank nearly 2 bottles of Medoc from her parents' liquor shelf, and Tom got so sleepy he could have spent the night right where he was lying on the floor. They had often slept side by side on the 2 big bearskin rugs in front of the fireplace, and it was another of the wonderful things about Cleo that she never wanted or expected him to make a pass at her, and he never had. But Tom hauled himself up at 11:15 and took his leave. "I won't see you again, will I?" Cleo said dejectedly at the door. "Oh, I should be back in about 6 weeks," Tom said, though he didn't think so at all. Suddenly he leaned forward and planted a firm, brotherly kiss on her ivory cheek. "I'll miss you, Cleo." She squeezed his shoulder, the only physical touch he could recall her ever having given him. "Oh, I'll miss you," she said. The next day he took care of Mr. Greenleaf's commissions at Brooks Brothers. the dozen pairs of black woolen socks, and the bathrobe. Mrs. Greenleaf had not suggested a color for the bathrobe. She would leave that up to him, she had said. Tom chose a dark maroon flannel with a navy blue belt and lapels. It was not the best looking robe of the lot, in Tom's opinion, but it felt it was exactly what Richard would have chosen, and that Richard would be delighted with it. He put the socks and the robe on the Greenleaf's charge account. He saw a heavy linen sports shirt with wooden buttons that he liked very much. That would have been easy to put on the Greenleaf's account too, but he didn't. He bought it with his own money.